Well, ladies and gentlemen, and this is Eastern Front World War II animated 1943 to 1944 by the channel Eastory. As 1942 ended, it became clear that Germany would not be able to defeat the Red Army. The question was, now that the resources of the Soviet Union had been greatly reduced and the Germans had the defensive advantage, did the Red Army have the strength to push the German back and avoid a stalemate? So this is Eastern Front is really interesting because how desperate Nazis were, right? And around this time, how effed up Stalin was, right? He was just throwing bodies at the Germans, while Germans were really desperate to take the resources that Russian had, and they were they were outside of their comfort zone, right? So quick victory strategy was not working, so they were a bit of outside of their comfort zone, and they were a bit desperate for time too. They were deploying tanks like Ferdinand, which was supposed to be long distance tank, but they were sending them through the enemy lines because they were that desperate. And for tanks like Ferdinand didn't have machine guns and things like that, so when an enemy came close, that's it, the tank was screwed. Then somebody told me that later on they added machine guns and things like that to that. But the point is, Germans were really, desperate for time as well. And Russians, Soviets, basically, obviously they didn't have the skill of the Germans because, I don't know, but they didn't have a proper generals or something at the time. I'm betting Stalin killed them, most of them, I guess. I don't know. But the point is, Stalin was so fucked up, he was ready to throw all the people of the Soviet Union at them. And you can't quickly win over something like that. So obviously, Hitler was doomed at that point because of that, Stalin's that strategy. So I guess in this we'll see how the tide turns over and I guess Germany, falls back. So let's see this one.
In the last months of 1942, the German forces were encircled at Stalingrad. At first, the Germans hoped to reverse the situation by relieving the pocket and maintaining it by air supply. However, as 1943 began, the Germans were forced to abandon their plans to relieve the city and were pushed back from its approaches. Despite that, they ordered their troops in Stalingrad to hold out as long as possible in order to tie up Soviet units and buy time. The advance of the Red Army created the possibility of the German troops in the Caucasus to be cut off. They ordered a full withdrawal from the region while their forces in the north kept the path of retreat open. The main effort of the Red Army was, however, directed against the Hungarian and Italian units on the northern flank. Their lightly equipped forces were unable to hold the line and were forced into a harsh winter retreat. Most of them lost their combat capabilities or were destroyed, leaving a large gap in the Axis lines.
Whoa!
The German units in the north had also to retreat, but they were able to keep their battle-worthiness intact. At the same time, the Germans managed to pull back part of their forces from the Caucasus. The remaining troops formed a breachhead on the coast to retain the opportunity for a summer push towards the oil fields. During January, both sides had their full attention set on the southern sector. The lack of the German reserves allowed the Red Army to achieve two small but significant victories. They re-established a land connection to Leningrad, and in the central part of the front, they captured the railway junction of Velikie Luki. For the Axis, the situation in the south continued to deteriorate. The German troops in Stalingrad surrendered, freeing up significant numbers of Soviet units.
Damn.
The Red Army forces moving west into the
things are turning around in this video, right? Now German POWs are the one, who's being caught.
Ukraine were not very formidable, but the large gap in the Axis line left them little opposition. The Soviet command decided to exploit this opportunity and attempted to cut off almost all of the army group south. In response, the Germans used the forces retreating from the Caucasus to extend their front eastwards and pulled their main force west. The Red Army moved further west to bypass their line and encircle them, but this overextended their forces. The Germans counterattacked from two sides and disorganized their forward detachments. Having caught the Soviet southern flank off...
See, that's the thing. Soviets cannot just immediately run behind and cut off the German forces who are in the south area where the oil fields are, right? Because that would basically mean that they would make sure the line is now thin because they moved way too forward. That gives Germans easier way to, I guess, trap them like they have been doing for so long. So you cannot leave your flank open now, even though it would be advantageous for you, right? Like, cutting them off in the south would mean a massive victory for Soviets. You can't take that risk even because Nazis are really unpredictable, right? They would trap you if you just give them chance. So you can't leave your flank open like that.
Balance. The Germans now wanted to push in both from north and south at the same time, destroying the whole Soviet force. They began to muster their units for the northern attack. In the south, their troops continued onwards, retaking Kharkov. But in the north, they failed to concentrate a force sufficient for the attack, though they were able to stop the Red Army's advance. By this time, both the Soviets and the Germans had exhausted their forces and went on defensive. As the fighting in the south had drawn all German reinforcements, the Red Army prepared to launch a major offensive in the north and center. The Germans realized the danger and responded by abandoning their most vulnerable positions before the Soviets had finished deployment, and the attacks that took place failed to achieve their goals. Being confronted with a much stronger German line, the Red Army abandoned its offensive plans and the Eastern Front became quiet. With the end of the winter campaign, the Axis had lost the capabilities necessary to knock the Soviet Union out of the war by capturing the areas vital for its war effort. Now they planned to win through attrition by holding on to the occupied areas and inflicting vast casualties to the attacking Red Army. In this way, they could drain the areas remaining under the Soviet control, dry up resources, and create a stalemate. The Red Army, on the other hand, set out to take back the economic...
Yeah, so now Nazis basically are in the defensive mode, which they didn't want it from the start. They wanted those areas and resources, but now they have no choice but to be defensive mode, right? Kill as many people as you can and create a stalemate. Otherwise, Soviets push in, come close to the Germany now.
Vital western lands of the Soviet Union, which would give it a strategic advantage. However, this time they would play it safe. Their previous offensives had been threatened by the German armored counterattacks, and this time they decided to receive them on prepared defenses. At the same time, with building up the fortifications, the Red Army formed a massive offensive force. As part of their defense strategy, the Germans planned a number of limited offensives to encircle Soviet forces and shorten their defensive line. The most promising of these was the encirclement of the Soviet units in the Kursk salient. It took 3 months for the German build-up to match the gradually improved Soviet defense.
Okay, what was the population of Russia and Soviet Union around this time? 70-80 million at best? I don't know. I think that would be their number, right? Russia is right now 70-80 million or 60 million, something like that. So 7 million people. That's a lot of number. And lots of million also got captured and died. Let's not forget about that.
And in the beginning of July, they launched their attack. The Germans made some headway, but were ultimately stopped dead in the depth of the Soviet defenses. Having for the time tied up the strongest German armored units, the Red Army now released its forces for the offensive. The attacks were to be carried out in consecutive stages along several sectors of the front. First, the Red Army struck into the rear of the German troops north of Kursk. Being unable to contain the attack and wishing to avoid the danger of encirclement, the Germans began the process of evacuating the salient. At the same time, the Red Army launched an attack in the south.
This is ridiculous. Look at their units and look at this Russians unit. Holy shit. Soviets, whatever.
The Germans redeployed their forces and contained it. By this time, the Soviet units south of Kursk had finished reorganization and pushed towards Kharkov. The Germans redeployed their forces to the sector but failed to hold the city, though succeeded in temporarily containing the Soviet advance. The situation in the north was more under the German control. The Red Army failed to break through the German defenses near Smolensk. At the same time, the Germans had finished their withdrawal to the new line, strengthening their positions further. By this time, the Germans had been able to maintain the balance and check the Red Army's attacks. However, the renewal of the Soviet offensive near the sea broke the German line and forced them into a large-scale retreat. Even more, the concurrent offensive against the lightly fortified German positions on the former western edge of the Kursk salient resulted in a breakthrough the Germans weren't able to contain.
Yeah, there's so many people.
They now realized that they lacked the troops necessary to contain the Soviets in their present line and ordered a retreat to a much better defendable Panther-Wotan position that was centered around the Dnieper river and its tributaries. At the same time, the Soviet breakthrough near Smolensk hastened the retreat of Army Group Center. With the German forces taking a stronger defensive position, the Red Army had to concentrate its main effort on a shorter section of the front. They decided to make regaining western Ukraine the main priority. First, however, we'll take a look at the central part of the front, where the Red Army had outrun the Germans to the Dnieper and had established a breachhead on the junctions of the Army Group Center and South. They planned to trap the whole Army Group Center by combined strikes from the breachhead and from a breakthrough in the north, while the other forces would pin the Germans in place. In October,
Damn.
while part of the Red Army was still recovering from the pursuit, battles were fought in order to secure the breachhead.
This is, a completely different Red Army, right? From the start of this series, because at the start they were losing so badly, they were getting captured so much, like they're amateur or something. Now suddenly they're doing all these tactics. They'll learn things like how Nazis are doing, how Nazis are basically, closing their flanks and capturing them. This army they're fighting right now is feel completely different than the start of it.
Meanwhile, the other forces began creating a breach in the northern part of the front. With their main focus being in the south, the Red Army had established several breachheads over the Dnieper in Ukraine. After they had got their heavy equipment over the river, they attempted local breakouts, first of which took place in the south. The Germans were able to contain it. Then the Soviets broke through the German land front, severing their connection with the Crimea. They proceeded with another breakout attempt near Kiev, but the Germans redeployed their troops and pushed it back towards the river. Having not fully succeeded in the breakouts, the Red Army adopted a more systematic approach, slowly but surely expanding its breachheads and massing troops for a larger breakout. In the center, the Red Army was now better prepared, which allowed it to increase the pressure. It resulted in a breakthrough in the north. The Germans held on to the flanks in the hopes of conducting a counterattack and cutting the Soviet forces off. Then the Soviets launched their main attack from the southern breachhead. It broke through the lines and gained limited success, though it failed to achieve its objective. The Germans were able to prevent a deeper breakthrough by abandoning territory and pulling back their front line. As 1943...
Germans are like wolves, right? As soon as someone try to break through it, they suddenly go in the sides, like about to flank them or something, like trap them. Every time I see that, it's, suddenly Soviets push forward really fast. This suddenly go to sides like I'm going to trap them, and that's the tactics.
Indeed, the Red Army was ready for the winter offensive, which would encompass the whole Soviet-German front. In Ukraine, the Germans had concentrated their defenses in the Great Bend of the Dnieper. This allowed the Red Army to catch them off balance by mounting a breakout from the Kiev breachhead. The Germans managed to contain their advance only with great difficulties. They wanted to keep their last position near the Dnieper River as a staging area for a possible counterattack and did not evacuate it despite the evident threat. The Red Army exploited this by cutting the salient off with a two-pronged attack. The Germans launched a rescue attempt and were able to retrieve part of the encircled forces, but without their heavy equipment. With the German attention directed towards the pocket, the Soviet forces launched attacks on the flanks, threatening to sever the connection between the army groups south and center. Meanwhile, Soviet troops were continuing with their attempt to encircle Army Group Center itself. In the north, the Germans realized they lacked the force to cut off the Red Army's breakthrough and abandoned the exposed salients. The Red Army now attempted to encircle the town of Vitebsk, but it was not met with success. Most of the Red Army's offensive assets were deployed in the south, and as a result, the goals of the Soviet forces in the center proved to be beyond the means to achieve them. The offensives took limited territory at the price of large casualties and were eventually abandoned. During the summer, the Soviet pressure on the army...
Yeah, so see, I've reacted to lots of historical videos like Napoleonic Wars and things. So if some kind of that kind of war, like I could say, Alexander the Great, like, Julius Caesar, Napoleon, somebody like that, that people are running around with horses, phalanx, and swords and shit. This is World War II. There are tanks, there are planes. So all you're saying is this massive scale. There are lots of tanks basically. So every line, there are tank warfare going around the town. Towns are crumbling down because of tanks shooting left and right, both sides, right? There's a massive tank warfare. Tanks are used like they're soldiers or something. Lots of tanks running around, thousands of tanks, right? In previous video, I don't know, maybe it was, in extra history video, right? Battle of Kursk. He said there was a massive, 4,000 or 5,000 tanks coming towards them, like a massive line of tanks coming towards the enemy. So this is just ridiculous. Imagining all that, like all this is happening, and everywhere there are tanks. Tanks are hitting everything. There are planes in the skies. Holy shit, this war was just ridiculous.
Army Group North had not been as strong as against the other army groups, and the Germans had dispatched a lot of its strength to other fronts. Despite its greatly reduced strength, the army group had not withdrawn to the shorter line and still held its forward positions. the Red Army attempted to encircle part of the German forces during the winter offensive. The Germans evaded the encirclement and then attempted to resist on the new positions, but they lacked the strength to do so, and it was decided to withdraw to the Panther Line. Both armies settled on the new line, and during the remaining part of the winter, the Red Army undertook only some limited attacks in order to probe the German defenses. The Red Army was planning to achieve its main success in the south. During the preceding half-year, the Soviet forces were slowly but steadily consolidating their positions on the west bank of the Dnieper, and by the beginning of March, this process was complete. The German Army Group South was by then pushed into the open plains and did not
they are just 364,000 against 1.5 million Soviets, and they're still holding the line. What the fuck?
retreat behind any other natural obstacle, leaving it vulnerable. The Soviets...
Yeah, that's like, near 5 times as more people, 4 or 5 times. So this is just ridiculous. I mean, you have to be really, good, soldiers on the field, right? With your experienced troops and everything, tanks. I mean, obviously the Tiger tanks had double the Tigers, and Panthers had double the range of the Soviet tanks. So there are lots of elements at play here. But look at that, 364,000 versus 1.5 million. They're still holding the line. In any time you would think that if that much of a difference there is, they would basically push them back all the way to Germany. But they can't do here because that's how effed up Nazis were. And they were fighting really, really hard because, like I've said in lots of videos, this is not just about, like in World War I, this is not just about territories. Like some people want some other territories. It's about the countries. No, this is about ideologies. Nazism versus communism. And ideologies is like kind of like religion. They are really strong in people's mind. Right, in a Battle of Kursk video in Extra History, we saw one SS officer just drop his pen for whatever reason. There was an issue there, and ran naked into the enemy. That's how committed he was. This is just fucked up.
Wanted to pin the whole army group to the Carpathian Mountains or the Black Sea and destroy it. The Axis were unable to resist the Soviet tank armies, and the whole front fell back. Near the Black Sea, they began pulling back their forces, but in the west, the Red Army encircled several German corps. The Soviets made the mistake by expecting the Germans to retreat southwards, which allowed them to extract most of the trapped force.
See, that's what I'm talking about. This is the second time this has happened in just past few minutes of the video. They capture German POWs and they somehow escapes. How powerful you have to be to do that? Imagine if Germans somehow had time to prepare for the war, right, for a few years, rather than how Hitler suddenly started the campaign, thinking I'll attack everybody. Maybe he was a bit more conniving, right? Maybe he was like Bismarck somewhat, thinking a bit ahead. And, he gathered troops and, slowly took our countries before people realized that he's trying to take everything. And by then, Germany is way too big and too many troops. How fucked up that would have been. Right now, he's really outnumbered and still this is happening.
Back to their front lines. Then the Red Army captured the Crimea as the last operation of the winter campaign. The Soviet Union had taken back its most economically valuable lands and gained the resources it needed to defeat Germany completely. However, with the front being still more close to Moscow than Berlin, the question was, how long shall it take? The Germans, meanwhile, had other problems to deal with. The Western Allies had landed in Italy and were preparing to do the same in France. The race to Berlin was on.
Yeah, but that's the issue with Soviet Union and Russia in general. The Moscow is way close to the enemy lines than not. That's why in Soviet Union they took some of the countries around Moscow, so there is more ground. If some other countries try to invade them, they can't just walk into Moscow because there is a ground in between them for them to prepare. So Moscow is already closer to the border, but damn, it's like Nazis push didn't matter because they're back to where they started. But now since they played all their cards, people know what they're about, right? Now Soviets will basically push on all the way to Berlin, and obviously in the Western Front, Normandy and everything, they will push towards Berlin too and encircle the Nazi. There you go, the end. If you summarize the entire World War II in the Nazi side, basically Hitler was way too quick to show aggression to everyone, right? He thought that by taking one by one territory, he's going to take everyone. Like he has time to think and breathe between taking over places. This like he's in some 15th or 16th century. No, this is 20th century, right? If you attack at this global scale and this speed of using tanks and things, people will take notice and this would happen. So, if he had, slowly taken over countries by countries, right, breaking treaties and things, just biding times, and creating a massive land area. Then he suddenly attacked like he did Paris and everything. Maybe he would have more chances. But even then, you can't attack the whole world, right? UK, USA, most countries would join in eventually. Because not everybody wants to speak, not everybody wants to be Aryan. And he didn't want to convert people into Aryan. He wanted to kill people who are lesser race, like he did with the Jews. He would have done the same thing with the Soviets. He did do that with POWs. This was just fucked up from the start. Alright, well, that was Eastern Front World War II animated 1943-1944 by the channel Eastory. If you like my reaction, don't forget to like, subscribe, check out the Rick Sunday. There's a link in the description. Check out the cast for play, check out the cards in. Yeah, I'll see you next time.